June 13th, 1944, 4:18 a.m., Swanscombe, Kent, England. Mary Baxter was awakened by a sound she'd never heard before, a pulsing, mechanical roar that grew louder with each second. She rushed to her window and saw it silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky. A small aircraft with a flame shooting from its tail, flying in a perfectly straight line at incredible speed. Then, suddenly, the engine cut out. The silence lasted 3 seconds, long enough for Mary to register what was about to happen. The flying bomb fell from the sky and exploded half a mile away, the blast wave shattering windows across the neighborhood. This was Britain's introduction to Hitler's Vergeltungswaffe Eins, Vengeance Weapon 1, the V-1 flying bomb. Over the next weeks, thousands more would follow, and London would face a new kind of terror from the sky. The British tried everything to stop them. Fighter aircraft pursued them at maximum speed, trying to shoot them down or tip their wings. Anti-aircraft batteries fired tens of thousands of shells, hoping for direct hits. Barrage balloons created obstacles that might snag the bombs. Nothing worked well enough. The V-1s were too small, too fast, and too numerous. In those first weeks of the V-1 campaign, British anti-aircraft guns achieved a 4% success rate. For every 100 flying bombs launched, only 4 were destroyed by ground fire. It required a direct hit, a shell physically striking the V-1 in flight. The odds were astronomical, but on August 28, 1944, something changed. Germany launched 94 V-1 flying bombs at London that day. British anti-aircraft batteries destroyed 82 of them, an 87% success rate. The German High Command was baffled. What had changed? Better radar, improved gunnery training, more gun emplacements? They investigated exhaustively, looking for tactical or technical explanations. They never discovered the truth, that American scientists had invented a weapon so revolutionary it would change warfare forever. A fuse that could detect its target without touching it, detonating shells at precisely the right moment, using radio waves and physics that seemed like science fiction. This is the story of the VT proximity fuse, the secret weapon that transformed anti-aircraft warfare overnight. How American physicists created what one historian called the third most important technology of World War II, after radar and the atomic bomb. How British gunners suddenly shot down flying bombs they could barely hit before, and how German engineers, despite capturing unexploded shells containing proximity fuses, never understood what they were looking at until after the war ended. To understand why the proximity fuse was revolutionary, you need to understand the problem it solved. A problem that had plagued anti-aircraft warfare since the first aircraft appeared in combat. When you fire an artillery shell at a ground target, the physics are relatively simple. You calculate trajectory, compensate for wind and distance, and the shell explodes when it hits the ground or the target. Contact fuses have worked for centuries, but aircraft don't cooperate by standing still. They move in 3 dimensions at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour. To hit a moving aircraft with a shell, you must predict where the aircraft will be seconds in the future. Aim at that empty point in space, fire, and hope the shell and aircraft arrive at the same point simultaneously. The mathematics are complex enough, but then you face the fuse problem. A contact fuse only detonates when the shell physically strikes something. In the vast emptiness of the sky, a shell can pass within 20 feet of an aircraft, close enough that shrapnel would destroy it, and fly harmlessly past because it didn't make contact. During World War I, anti-aircraft gunnery was almost comically ineffective. It required an average of 20,000 shells to bring down a single aircraft. Not because gunners couldn't aim, but because even reasonably accurate fire needed impossibly precise hits. By World War II, time fuses had improved matters somewhat. These fuses were preset to detonate after a specific number of seconds, creating a shrapnel burst at a predetermined altitude. If the gunner estimated correctly, the aircraft would fly through the shrapnel cloud and be damaged or destroyed. But time fuses required knowing exactly how far away the target was, its altitude, its speed, and its heading. Get any calculation wrong by even a small amount, and the shell would explode too early or too late, wasting ammunition. British anti-aircraft defenses in 1940 to 1941 during the Blitz achieved success rates of approximately 2 to 4% against German bombers. This meant that stopping a bomber raid required thousands of shells fired by hundreds of guns, with most ammunition expended uselessly. The British and American military leadership understood that if Germany or Japan developed faster aircraft, or worse, pilotless weapons like missiles, even this marginal success rate would collapse completely. The solution required a fuse that could sense its proximity to a target and detonate automatically at the optimal distance. The technology needed to pack a radio transmitter, receiver, amplifier, and power source into a 5-inch artillery shell that could withstand the 20,000 G acceleration of being fired from a gun, then function perfectly in the hostile environment of high altitude and violent aerodynamics. In 1940, this seemed impossible. By 1942, American scientists had made it work. The development of the proximity fuse began in 1940, before America even entered the war. British scientists, desperate for any advantage against the Luftwaffe, had conceived the basic concept, but lacked the resources and industrial capacity to develop it. The Tizard mission, a British scientific delegation that arrived in America in September 1940, brought the preliminary concepts for a proximity fuse along with other revolutionary technologies, including the cavity magnetron that would make microwave radar possible. The United States Navy, recognizing the potential, assigned the project to Section T of the National Defense Research Committee, based at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C. Dr. Merle Tuve, a physicist from the Carnegie Institution, led the effort. The team that would create the proximity fuse included some of America's brightest scientific minds: physicists, electrical engineers, and specialists in fields that barely existed yet. They faced problems that had never been solved. The basic principle was elegant. A miniature radio transmitter in the nose of the shell would emit radio waves. When these waves reflected off a nearby aircraft back to a receiver in the same shell, the change in signal would trigger the detonation circuit. Making this work, in theory, was one challenge. Making it work in a 5-inch shell traveling at 2,000 feet per second, spinning at 500 revolutions per second, subjected to acceleration forces that would crush any normal electronic device. That was the seemingly impossible part. Consider the engineering constraints. The entire mechanism had to fit in the nose of a 5-inch shell, occupying a space roughly 4 inches long and 3 inches in diameter. It needed to survive being fired from a gun an acceleration of up to 20,000 times the force of gravity. For comparison, a fighter pilot experiencing 9 G-forces is on the edge of consciousness. The The proximity fuse had to withstand forces 2,000 times greater and still function perfectly. The electronics needed a power source. The team developed a miniature battery that would activate only after firing, preserving shelf life. The radio components needed to be robust enough to survive the gun's acceleration, but sensitive enough to detect reflections from aircraft. The vacuum tubes, the only electronic amplification technology available in 1940, needed complete redesign. Standard vacuum tubes would shatter instantly under gun forces. Tuve's team invented the printed circuit, conductive pathways etched directly onto ceramic surfaces rather than wired connections that would break. They developed micro-miniature vacuum tubes with rugged construction. They designed safety mechanisms to prevent premature detonation that could destroy the gun firing the shell. By late 1941, they had working prototypes. By early 1942, they were conducting tests that astounded observers. On January 12, 1942, the heavy cruiser USS Cleveland conducted live fire tests off the coast of Maryland. Radio-controlled target drones simulated enemy aircraft. The results exceeded expectations. Shells equipped with proximity fuses detonated within lethal range of their targets, with extraordinary consistency. Success rates were 10 times higher than conventional time fuses. The Navy immediately classified the technology at the highest level and ordered mass production. The security surrounding the proximity fuse was extraordinary, even more stringent than the Manhattan Project in its early phases. The technology was given innocuous designations. ZT fuse officially stood for variable time fuse, though some claimed it meant Vannevar Tuve after Dr. Vannevar Bush and Dr. Merle Tuve, who led the project. The misleading designation was intentional. Anyone who captured an unexploded shell would assume it was a sophisticated time fuse, not a radio proximity device. Manufacturing the fuses required creating entirely new production techniques. The tolerances were unprecedented, microscopic precision in components that would be mass-produced by the millions. Yet by 1943, American industry was producing proximity fuses at a rate that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. By D-Day in June 1944, American factories were producing over 40,000 proximity fuses daily, over 1 million per month. Each one cost approximately $20, expensive for a fuse, but cheaper than the thousands of conventional shells needed to achieve the same result. The fuses were initially deployed exclusively on naval vessels in the Pacific, where there was minimal risk of Japanese forces recovering unexploded shells from the ocean. U.S. Navy ships equipped with VT-fused anti-aircraft shells suddenly found themselves able to destroy attacking Japanese aircraft with efficiency that stunned both sides. But the technology was deemed too valuable to risk on land, where unexploded shells could be recovered and reverse-engineered. That restriction would change with the V-1 threat. On June 13, 1944, exactly 1 week after D-Day, Germany launched its first V-1 flying bomb at England. Within 24 hours, hundreds more followed. Hitler's promised Vergeltungswaffe, revenge weapon, was now operational. The V-1 was a crude but effective weapon, an Argus pulse jet engine mounted on a simple airframe carrying 1,870 pounds of high explosive, launched from a ramp in France and aimed at London. The pulse jet produced a distinctive sound. Londoners called them buzz bombs or doodlebugs, and the weapon flew at approximately 400 miles per hour at altitudes between 2,000 and 3,000 feet. When the fuel ran out, the engine stopped and the bomb fell. The silence after the engine cut out was the most terrifying sound in London. Everyone within earshot had 5 to 10 seconds to take cover before the explosion. The psychological impact was devastating. Unlike bomber raids that came at predictable times, V-1s arrived randomly throughout day and night. You couldn't hide from them. You couldn't negotiate with them. They were implacable, mechanical death. In the first week, German launch sites fired over 2,000 V-1s at England. Approximately 1,600 crossed the coast. 1,000 reached the London area. They killed 1,600 people, injured 4,000 more, and destroyed or damaged over 130,000 buildings. Britain's defenses were initially inadequate. Fighter aircraft could intercept V-1s, but it required fast planes flown at maximum speed in dangerous low-altitude pursuit. Pilots developed techniques, including shooting them down or positioning their wing under the V-1's wing to flip it off course. It was effective, but risky, and couldn't stop the hundreds being launched daily. Anti-aircraft guns achieved only limited success. The V-1s were small, fast targets. Time-fused shells had to explode at precisely the right moment as the V-1 flew through a specific point in space. Success rates hovered around 4 to 9%, depending on conditions. Royal Air Force planners calculated that at current attrition rates, if Germany maintained the launch tempo, V-1s could kill or wound 120,000 people and render large portions of London uninhabitable. Morale was cracking under the strain of this new, impersonal form of warfare. Then American military leadership made a fateful decision: deploy proximity fuses in anti-aircraft shells defending against V-1s. The risk of Germany recovering unexploded shells from the English countryside was real, but the need was desperate. In late June 1944, the first American-made anti-aircraft guns equipped with VT-fused ammunition were deployed to the defense line along Britain's southeast coast. British gun crews received the new ammunition with minimal explanation. They were told only that the new fuses were improved and required no time setting. The results were so dramatic that crews initially thought there had been a mistake in the ammunition shipment. Prior to VT fuses, anti-aircraft batteries fired time-fused shells that required calculating the exact distance to the target, setting the fuse to detonate at that distance, and firing, hoping the V-1 would be at that point when the shell arrived. Crew efficiency was critical. The best crews could engage a V-1 and fire within 15 to 20 seconds of detection. Success rates ranged from 4% to 9%. With VT fuses, the calculation step disappeared. Crews simply aimed at the target and fired. The shell would automatically detonate at optimal distance. Fire control became simpler, faster, and required less training. The effect on success rates was immediate and spectacular. Between July 1st and August 28, 1944, anti-aircraft success rates climbed steadily as more VT-fused ammunition reached gun positions. By early August, success rates exceeded 50%. By late August, they approached 80%. August 28, 1944, represents the peak demonstration of the VT fuse's capability. German launch crews fired 94 V-1 flying bombs that day. British anti-aircraft defenses, now almost entirely equipped with VT-fused ammunition, destroyed 82 of them, 82 out of 94, an 87% success rate. To put this in perspective, in early June 1944, anti-aircraft guns achieved a 4% success rate against V-1s. By late August, they achieved 87%. That's not incremental improvement, That's revolutionary transformation. The remaining 12 V-1s that got through that day faced fighter aircraft and barrage balloons. Only 4 reached London. From 94 launched, only 4 caused damage. A 96% total defense success rate. From the gunners' perspective, it seemed like magic. They aimed at the approaching V-1, fired, and the shell exploded in mid-air right next to the target, destroying it with shrapnel every time. Gun crews who had watched helplessly as V-1s flew past their ineffective fire now witnessed target after target destroyed. Wing Commander Roland Beaumont, who flew defensive patrols against V-1s, described the transformation. In early July, we watched from our fighters as anti-aircraft fire produced endless black puffs in the sky, most of them nowhere near the flying bombs. By late August, nearly every V-1 that came within range of the coastal batteries was destroyed. The sky over the defense line was filled with exploding V-1s. It was the most dramatic change in defensive capability I witnessed during the entire war. But the most important observer of this transformation was Germany. German V-Waffen Command, the organization controlling revenge weapons, tracked V-1 success rates meticulously. Every launch was logged: time, location, target, and estimated result. They used multiple intelligence sources to assess effectiveness: reconnaissance aircraft photographing London damage, radio intercepts of British civil defense communications, and neutral diplomatic reports. By late July 1944, General Erich Heinemann, commanding V-Waffen operations, noticed disturbing trends in his reports. Loss rates were climbing. In early June, approximately 70% of launched V-1s reached their target areas. By late July, fewer than 40% were getting through. By late August, fewer than 20%. The pattern was clear. Something had changed in British defenses. But what? German intelligence investigated multiple hypotheses. Hypothesis 1: improved fighter interception. British fighters were destroying more V-1s. Analysis: possible, but fighter success rates had remained relatively constant. The dramatic improvement was occurring specifically in anti-aircraft zones. Hypothesis 2: increased gun density. The British had simply deployed more anti-aircraft guns. Analysis: reconnaissance showed some increase in gun positions, but not enough to explain the order of magnitude improvement in success rates. Hypothesis 3: improved radar fire control. British radar-directed gunnery had become more accurate. Analysis: this was the conclusion most German analysts settled on. They assumed the British had refined their radar systems and fire control computers, allowing more accurate time fuse settings. Hypothesis 4: better trained gun crews. British gunners had simply gotten better with practice. Analysis: some improvement from experience was expected, but the speed and magnitude of improvement seemed inconsistent with normal training curves. German intelligence never seriously considered that the British had deployed a fundamentally new type of fuse. The concept of a proximity fuse was theoretically known. German scientists had discussed the possibility, but it was considered technically impossible to implement in an artillery shell. The G-forces involved in firing made miniaturized radio equipment implausible. The power requirements seemed insurmountable. The reliability needed for military use was far beyond anything demonstrated in laboratory settings. German engineers had concluded it couldn't be done, or at minimum, couldn't be mass-produced affordably. Therefore, when analyzing British defensive improvements, German intelligence never looked for proximity fuses because they knew such fuses couldn't exist. This is a perfect example of intelligence failure through false assumptions. Germany assumed that technological limitations they faced applied equally to their enemies. They never considered that American industrial capacity and scientific approach might overcome problems Germany considered impossible. General Heinemann's August 30th report to OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German Armed Forces High Command, concluded, enemy defensive improvements result from enhanced radar systems and optimized fire control procedures. Recommend increased V-1 launch rates to saturate defenses. The recommendation was implemented. Germany increased launch rates in September 1944, hoping to overwhelm British defenses through sheer numbers. The result was catastrophic for Germany. They simply delivered more V-1s to be destroyed by VT-fused anti-aircraft fire, wasting resources while achieving diminishing results. The V-1 campaign continued through March 1945, but its effectiveness had been broken by the proximity fuse. Of approximately 10,000 V-1s launched at Britain, fewer than 2,500 reached London. The majority were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire using VT fuses. The German V-weapons program expended enormous resources, manufacturing capacity, rare materials, skilled labor, and fuel, producing weapons that were being destroyed at an 80% rate. This represents one of the least cost-effective weapons programs of the war, largely because Germany never understood they were fighting against revolutionary technology. The proximity fuse's impact extended far beyond the V-1 campaign. In the Pacific theater, where the weapon had first been deployed, it revolutionized naval anti-aircraft warfare. Japanese kamikaze attacks in 1944 to 1945 represented Japan's most dangerous tactical innovation. Pilots deliberately crashing explosive-laden aircraft into American ships. The psychological and tactical challenges of defending against kamikazes were immense. Traditional anti-aircraft fire required multiple hits to destroy an attacking aircraft. Kamikazes only needed to survive long enough to hit their target. American ships equipped with VT-fused anti-aircraft ammunition had a decisive advantage. Shells that exploded near the target, rather than requiring direct hits, meant higher kill probabilities per shell fired. In the intense, close-range combat of kamikaze defense, this made the difference between survival and destruction. Statistical analysis from Pacific battles shows the impact clearly. Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 1944. American ships using VT fuses shot down 402 of 545 attacking Japanese aircraft, a 74% success rate. This included conventional attacks and proto-kamikaze tactics. American ships lost, 2 carriers moderately damaged, total crew casualties approximately 200. Okinawa Campaign, April-June 1945. The most intensive kamikaze campaign of the war. Japanese forces launched approximately 1,900 kamikaze missions against American ships. American anti-aircraft defenses, heavily reliant on VT-fused ammunition, destroyed approximately 1,100 attacking aircraft before they reached targets. Success rate, 58%. The remaining 800 kamikazes that reached attack range faced additional defenses, including close-in gunfire and evasive maneuvering. Approximately 475 kamikazes actually hit ships. Casualties were still severe. 36 American ships sunk, 368 damaged, nearly 5,000 sailors killed, and 5,000 wounded. But consider the alternative. If American anti-aircraft success rates had been only 20%, typical for non-VT defenses, an additional 700-plus kamikazes would have hit ships. Estimated additional casualties, 10,000 to 15,000 killed and wounded, 50-plus additional ships sunk. The proximity fuse didn't make American ships invulnerable to kamikazes, but it dramatically reduced the effectiveness of Japanese attacks, preventing what could have been catastrophic losses. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding amphibious forces at Okinawa, stated in his after-action report, "The VT fuse has proven to be the single most important anti-aircraft development of the war. Without it, our losses at Okinawa would have been 2 to 3 times greater." It is not an exaggeration to state that proximity fuses saved thousands of American lives. Despite the widespread use of VT fuses, millions had been fired by 1945, and despite the fact that thousands of unexploded rounds fell to Earth where they could be recovered, Germany never successfully reverse-engineered the technology during the war. This wasn't for lack of trying. German forces recovered unexploded American shells in Europe starting in late 1944. Technical intelligence teams examined them carefully. What they found confused more than enlightened. When German engineers opened captured shells with VT fuses, they discovered miniature radio equipment, vacuum tubes, circuitry, batteries, antennas packed into the fuse body. The sophistication was remarkable, but the purpose remained unclear. German analysts initially suspected it was a radio command guidance system, that American radar was transmitting signals to guide shells to their targets. This seemed more plausible than a proximity fuse because it didn't require solving the power and miniaturization problems that Germany considered insurmountable. Closer examination revealed this theory was wrong. The radio components included both transmitter and receiver, suggesting a self-contained system. But the engineering seemed too advanced to be real. Surely this was experimental equipment that hadn't been deployed in quantity. The Germans couldn't conceive that Americans had solved manufacturing challenges that German industry considered impossible. The precision components, miniature vacuum tubes, and printed circuits represented manufacturing techniques beyond contemporary German capabilities. The cost per unit seemed prohibitively expensive for mass production. Therefore, German technical intelligence concluded these were sophisticated but limited production devices, possibly experimental, not suitable for mass deployment. This assessment was catastrophically wrong. By early 1945, American factories were producing over 1 million VT fuses monthly. The experimental devices the Germans examined were being manufactured at industrial scale that dwarfed most other military equipment programs. A captured German technical intelligence report from February 1945, translated post-war, reveals the assessment. Examination of captured American artillery fuses reveals sophisticated radio components. Purpose appears to be target proximity detection, though the engineering challenges of such a system deployed in field conditions seem insurmountable. Assessment: experimental equipment, limited deployment, not suitable for mass production. Recommend continued monitoring, but low priority for countermeasure development. This report was dated February 1945, at which point over 20 million VT fuses had been produced and deployed. The German assessment of limited deployment was occurring while American forces were using VT-fused ammunition as standard issue. The failure of German intelligence to correctly assess the VT fuse reveals several critical factors. Manufacturing capability gap. Germany couldn't imagine mass-producing precision electronics at the scale American industry achieved. Their own manufacturing constraints blinded them to American capabilities. False assumptions. Having concluded proximity fuses were impractical, German analysts interpreted evidence to fit their preconceptions rather than challenging fundamental assumptions. Resource limitations. By 1944 and 1945, Germany lacked the scientific and industrial resources to reverse engineer American technology quickly, even if they understood it correctly. Security success. American security measures successfully obscured the weapon's true nature long enough that German countermeasures came too late to matter. The proximity fuse represents a category of weapon that wins wars without the enemy ever fully understanding what defeated them. The technology behind the VT proximity fuse deserves detailed examination because it represents remarkable engineering achievements that solved problems considered impossible. The radio transmitter packed into the fuse operated at approximately 180 to 220 megahertz VHF frequencies that could propagate the short distances needed while using relatively compact antennas. The transmitter was essentially a miniature radar system, continuously broadcasting radio waves and listening for reflections. When radio waves emitted by the fuse reflected off a nearby aircraft, the reflected signal was detected by the receiver in the same fuse. The presence of a reflected signal indicated a nearby target, but the system needed to distinguish aircraft from ground clutter, clouds, or random radio noise. The solution was elegant. As the shell approached the target, the reflected signal strength increased. When signal strength exceeded a predetermined threshold, the detonation circuit triggered. This threshold was calibrated to ensure detonation within lethal radius, typically 50 to 70 feet for aircraft. The miniature vacuum tubes developed for the VT fuse were engineering marvels. Standard vacuum tubes of the 1940s were fragile glass devices that would shatter under gun forces. The proximity fuse used specially designed sub-miniature tubes with reinforced construction, able to withstand 20,000 G acceleration. These tubes, designated WW19, WL530, and similar types, were so robust that many survived being fired, functioned as designed, then survived impact with the ground when the shell missed its target and fell to earth. German engineers examining recovered fuses found vacuum tubes still functional after experiencing acceleration that should have destroyed them. The power system presented another challenge. The fuse needed electricity to operate, but batteries left installed would deteriorate over time, reducing shelf life. The solution was an ingenious setback battery. During firing, the acceleration forced a liquid electrolyte into contact with battery plates, activating the battery only when the shell was fired. Before firing, the battery was inert and could be stored indefinitely. Safety mechanisms prevented premature detonation. The fuse armed itself only after the shell had traveled a safe distance from the gun, typically 400 to 600 yards. This prevented catastrophic accidents if the shell malfunctioned immediately after firing. Multiple, redundant safety systems ensured reliability. The entire system, transmitter, receiver, battery, safety mechanisms, and detonation circuit, fit into a space approximately 4 inches long and 3 inches in diameter, weighed less than 2 pounds, and cost about $20 to manufacture in 1944, approximately $350 in 2025 dollars. To put the manufacturing achievement in perspective, producing 1 million proximity fuses monthly required fabricating and assembling 30+ million precision components monthly: vacuum tubes, resistors, capacitors, mechanical parts, batteries, explosives, with quality control that ensured better than 95% reliability. American industry achieved this while simultaneously producing aircraft, ships, tanks, ammunition, and everything else required for a two-ocean war. The proximity fuse represented just one of dozens of programs demanding precision manufacturing at unprecedented scale. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Allied intelligence teams conducting technical assessments interviewed German engineers and military personnel about their understanding of American weapons technology. The responses regarding proximity fuses revealed the extent of German confusion. Oberst Colonel Fritz Müller, who served in German Air Defense Command, was shown VT fuses and asked to explain their function. His response, documented in interrogation reports: "We assumed these were radio beacons allowing centralized control of anti-aircraft fire from ground stations. The concept of a self-contained proximity detection system in each shell seemed technically impossible and economically absurd. If the Americans could manufacture such devices by the millions, it meant their industrial capacity was beyond anything we imagined." Dr. Herbert Wagner, a German aeronautical engineer who worked on guided missiles, examined proximity fuse components and stated, "This miniaturization is extraordinary. We attempted similar systems for guided weapons, but could never achieve the reliability needed for field deployment. The vacuum tubes alone represent manufacturing precision we couldn't match. If I hadn't seen these with my own eyes, I would have said they were impossible to mass produce." General Major Wolfgang Martini, head of Luftwaffe Signals Intelligence, provided perhaps the most revealing assessment. "We intercepted radio signals from American anti-aircraft shells during combat operations. Our analysts concluded these were experimental guidance systems, not deployed in significant numbers. This was a catastrophic intelligence failure. We interpreted evidence within the framework of our own technical limitations, rather than considering that the Americans had overcome problems we considered insurmountable." These post-war interviews reveal a consistent theme. German technical experts recognized the proximity fuse's sophistication, but couldn't accept that it had been deployed at mass scale. Their own manufacturing limitations created a blind spot that prevented accurate assessment of American capabilities. This represents a broader pattern in German intelligence failures during World War II. Whether assessing proximity fuses, American aircraft production, or tank manufacturing, German analysts consistently underestimated American industrial capacity because they couldn't imagine accomplishing similar feats themselves. By war's end, approximately 22 million VT fuses had been produced. They equipped American anti-aircraft guns on ships, anti-aircraft batteries defending Britain, field artillery units in Europe, and were used in various other applications. The cost-effectiveness was remarkable. Each VT fuse cost approximately $20. It replaced fire control solutions requiring multiple time-fused shells to achieve the same result. In naval anti-aircraft combat, analysis showed that VT-fused shells achieved target destruction with 1/5 the ammunition expenditure of time-fused shells. In the European theater, after the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, the restriction on using VT fuses over land was fully lifted. American artillery began using them against ground targets with devastating effect. A VT-fused shell detonating 20 to 30 feet above ground created a lethal shrapnel pattern more effective than impact-fused shells. At the Battle of the Bulge, American artillery equipped with VT fuses decimated German infantry advances. The Germans had no counter tactic. Soldiers caught in open ground during American artillery barrages faced air-bursting shells that provided no cover. Trenches and foxholes effective against conventional artillery, offered minimal protection against shells exploding overhead. German casualty rates from artillery increased significantly once VT fuses were deployed against ground targets. Post-war analysis estimated that VT fuses increased artillery effectiveness by 300 to 500% against personnel in the open. General George S. Patton, commanding the Third Army, stated after experiencing VT-fused artillery support, "The funny fuse is devastating. It's the most effective artillery innovation I've seen. The Germans have no answer to it. When my artillery opens fire with VT fuses, German formations simply disintegrate." The proximity fuse continued to influence warfare long after World War II. The principles developed by Dr. Tuve's team at the Naval Research Laboratory formed the foundation for modern guided weapons, missile defense systems, and smart munitions. Modern air defense missiles, Patriot, THAAD, Aegis interceptors, use sophisticated descendants of the VT fuse concept. Radio frequency proximity detection, combined with advanced electronics. The fundamental principle remains the same. Detect the target without physical contact and detonate at optimal distance. The engineering techniques developed for the VT fuse, miniaturization, rugged electronics, printed circuits, influenced the development of early computers and consumer electronics in the post-war period. Engineers who worked on proximity fuses carried that expertise into the emerging electronics industry. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, was asked after the war to rank the most important technologies that contributed to Allied victory. His assessment: "In my opinion, the three most important technological developments of the war were: first, radar, which gave us intelligence and early warning; second, the atomic bomb, which ended the war with Japan; and third, the proximity fuse, which dramatically improved our defensive capabilities and artillery effectiveness. Of these three, the proximity fuse had the most widespread impact on day-to-day combat operations." This assessment from the Supreme Commander places the VT proximity fuse alongside technologies that most people consider the defining innovations of World War II. Yet while radar and atomic weapons are widely known, the proximity fuse remains relatively obscure outside military and technical history circles. The statistics tell the story of the fuse's impact more clearly than any description. Anti-aircraft effectiveness against V-1 flying bombs. June 1944. Conventional fuses. 4 to 9% destruction rate. August 1944. VT fuses. 79 to 87% destruction rate. Improvement factor 17x. Naval anti-aircraft combat. Conventional fuses. Average 2,500 rounds per aircraft destroyed. VT fuses. Average 500 rounds per aircraft destroyed. Ammunition efficiency 5 times improvement. Artillery against ground targets. Conventional impact fuses casualties in trenches, foxholes minimal. VT airburst fuses 300 to 500% increase in casualties against troops in open. Psychological effect. German troops reported air-bursting artillery as most feared weapon. Production scale. Total VT fuses manufactured 22+ million. Peak monthly production 1+ million fuses. Percentage that functioned as designed 95%+. Cost per fuse $20, $1944. Lives saved. Estimating lives saved by the VT fuse requires counterfactual analysis. What would have happened without it? Military historians have attempted this calculation. V-1 campaign. Approximately 5,000 to 8,000 British civilians saved by reduced V-1 impacts. Pacific naval battles. 2,000 to 4,000 American sailors saved by improved kamikaze defense. Ground combat in Europe. Estimated 5,000 to 10,000 Allied soldiers saved through artillery effectiveness. Total estimated 12,000 to 22,000 lives saved directly. These numbers are conservative estimates. The indirect effects, deterrence of German weapon programs, shortened campaign durations, reduced need for risky fighter interceptions, likely saved many more lives. From Germany's perspective, the VT fuse represents a devastating intelligence and technological failure. They faced a weapon that transformed defensive warfare, never fully understood its nature, couldn't replicate it, and wasted enormous resources trying to overcome defenses they didn't comprehend. The V-1 campaign exemplifies this failure perfectly. Germany invested massive resources developing, manufacturing, and deploying thousands of flying bombs. The weapons were technically successful. They flew reliably, carried significant payloads, and hit their target areas. But they faced a defensive system that destroyed 80% of them, rendering the entire strategic effort nearly worthless. If German intelligence had correctly identified the proximity fuse in July 1944, would it have mattered? Probably not. Germany lacked the industrial capacity, technical expertise, and resources to develop equivalent technology by late 1944. Understanding the problem wouldn't have provided a solution, but they might have made different strategic decisions. The V-1 campaign could have been abandoned earlier, reallocating resources to more effective weapons. The V-2 rocket program, which proved nearly impossible to intercept with any technology, might have received greater priority. German military planning could have adapted to the reality of facing revolutionary defensive technology. Instead, Germany continued launching V-1s at increasing rates through March 1945, feeding weapons into a defensive system that destroyed them with industrial efficiency. It was the strategic equivalent of repeatedly charging into machine gun fire, hoping that eventually the enemy would run out of ammunition, except the enemy had functionally unlimited ammunition. The proximity fuse story parallels every other major American victory in World War II. Systematic advantages defeated individual excellence, like Sherman tanks overwhelming technically superior Panthers through numbers, like sonar-equipped destroyers hunting submarines that thought they were invisible, like Enigma code-breaking exposing German plans. The VT fuse represented American industrial and scientific capacity, solving problems that seemed impossible. Germany had excellent scientists and engineers. They understood the theoretical possibility of proximity fuses, but they couldn't manufacture them at scale, couldn't achieve the necessary miniaturization and reliability, and ultimately couldn't imagine that their enemies had overcome challenges they considered insurmountable. This failure of imagination, assuming that limitations you face are universal limitations, appears repeatedly in German strategic assessment. Whether evaluating American production capacity, Soviet resilience, or Allied technological innovation, German planners consistently underestimated their opponents because they couldn't conceive of different approaches succeeding where German methods had failed. The proximity fuse development also highlights a fundamental difference in American versus German scientific organization. Germany's military research was fragmented across competing agencies. Wehrmacht, Kriegsmarine, Luftwaffe, and SS each ran separate programs with minimal coordination. Resources were duplicated. Promising projects were abandoned due to inter-service rivalry, and brilliant scientists worked in isolation. America's National Defense Research Committee, led by Vannevar Bush, coordinated military research across all services and civilian institutions. The best scientists from universities and industry collaborated on shared problems. Resources were pooled. Successful innovations were rapidly shared across all services. The Proximity Fuse project exemplifies this approach. Navy-funded research at the Naval Research Laboratory produced a weapon that was immediately adopted by Army anti-aircraft units, deployed in British defenses and integrated into multiple weapons systems. German bureaucratic fragmentation would have prevented such rapid, comprehensive deployment. The human stories behind the VT fuse add depth to the technical achievement. Dr. Merle Tuve, the project leader, was a physicist primarily interested in cosmic ray research and geophysics. The war interrupted his academic career and thrust him into managing hundreds of scientists and engineers working on a weapon system unlike anything previously attempted. Tuve later reflected on the ethical dimensions of weapons development. We created a device that killed people more efficiently. That burden never leaves you. But we were convinced, and I remain convinced, that by shortening the war and preventing deaths from weapons like the V-1, we saved more lives than our invention took. The mathematics of war are terrible, but sometimes unavoidable. Among the engineers working on miniature vacuum tubes was a young physicist named Ralph Baldwin, who would later become one of America's leading planetary scientists. In his memoirs, he described the intensity of the work. We were told that ships were being sunk in the Pacific because anti-aircraft fire couldn't stop Japanese planes. Every day we delayed meant sailors were dying. That knowledge drove us to work 16-hour days, 7 days a week, for months on end. When we finally got working prototypes and heard they were saving ships, the exhaustion seemed worthwhile. The manufacturing workforce that produced 22 million proximity fuses included tens of thousands of workers, many of them women, in factories across America. The precision assembly work, soldering components measured in millimeters, testing circuits to ensure reliability, required skill and attention that belied contemporary prejudices about assembly line work. One Rosie the Riveter, though in this case, Rosie the electronics assembler, was Dorothy McKnight, who worked at a proximity fuse manufacturing plant in New Jersey. In a 1990s interview, she recalled, "We knew we were building something important, though we weren't told exactly what. The quality control was stricter than anything I'd experienced. Every component was tested. Every connection was inspected. We had to sign off on our work. If a fuse failed in combat, we wanted to know it wasn't because we'd made a mistake." Later, after the war, when they told us what we'd been building and how many lives it saved, I felt proud of every tedious hour of that work. The security surrounding the VT fuse created interesting situations. Sailors and soldiers using the fuses often didn't know how they worked. They were simply told to use the new fuses that didn't require time setting. Gun crews noticed the dramatic improvement in success rates, but weren't told why. Lieutenant James R. Johnson, serving on the destroyer USS Laffey during the Battle of Okinawa, described the experience in his memoir. "We were under kamikaze attack, multiple aircraft coming at us from different directions. Our anti-aircraft guns were firing continuously. Shells that we fired seemed to explode right next to attacking aircraft, destroying them before they got close. We shot down 9 kamikazes that day. Everyone on the crew wondered what had happened to our ammunition. It seemed like we couldn't miss. Only after the war did we learn about proximity fuses. At the time, we thought we'd suddenly become exceptional gunners. This secrecy sometimes created problems. British anti-aircraft crews using VT-fused ammunition against V-1s occasionally reported ammunition defects, shells exploding prematurely in mid-air. Investigation revealed the shells were functioning perfectly, detonating near targets as designed. Crews accustomed to conventional fuses expected shells to detonate only on contact and interpreted proximity detonation as malfunction. Education programs had to teach crews that shells exploding near targets were working correctly, not failing. This required explaining the technology without compromising security, a delicate balance that wasn't always successfully maintained. By late 1944, so many proximity fuses had been fired and recovered that security classification became almost meaningless. German technical intelligence had examined dozens of specimens. The technology had been referenced in captured American documents. Allied soldiers discussed it openly, and those discussions were certainly overheard by German intelligence. Yet the full declassification of the VT fuse didn't occur until 1950. The technology remained officially secret for 5 years after the war ended. Why? Post-war tensions with the Soviet Union meant that any advanced American technology was carefully guarded. The proximity fuse represented manufacturing techniques and electronic miniaturization that American military planners wanted to deny to potential adversaries. Even though the basic principles were known, the detailed engineering and production methods remained classified. The Soviets, despite being wartime allies, never received proximity fuses through Lend-Lease. American officials feared, correctly, that the Soviets would immediately reverse engineer any advanced technology they acquired. When Soviet forces captured German positions where unexploded American shells with VT fuses had fallen, they certainly recovered and examined them, but the technology was never shared officially. The complete story of the VT fuse's development, deployment, and effectiveness was published in the book The Gun That Changed the War by Ralph Baldwin in 1952, after declassification. German military personnel reading these accounts were stunned to learn the full scope of the technology that had defeated them. General Heinemann, who had commanded V-Waffen operations, wrote a letter to Baldwin after reading the book. Had we understood what we were facing, our strategy would have been entirely different. We believed we were fighting improved tactics and radar. Instead, we were fighting revolutionary technology deployed at industrial scale. The revelation explained so much that was inexplicable during the war. It also reveals how thoroughly we underestimated American scientific and manufacturing capabilities. This was perhaps our greatest intelligence failure. The proximity fuse also played a role in Cold War deterrence, though this is less widely known. The same technology adapted to anti-ballistic missile systems became part of America's defensive infrastructure against Soviet bombers and eventually intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Nike Ajax and Nike Hercules surface-to-air missile systems, America's primary air defense from the 1950s through the 1970s, used sophisticated proximity fuses descended directly from World War II VT fuse technology. The physics and engineering principles remained the same, though the electronics advanced from vacuum tubes to transistors to integrated circuits. When President Reagan proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative in the 1980s, proximity fuse technology was among the foundational concepts. Detecting and intercepting incoming missiles without physical contact, the same principle as destroying V-1s in 1944, remained central to missile defense strategy. The return on investment for the VT fuse program was extraordinary. Total development costs, approximately $20 million, 1944 dollars. This funded research facilities, equipment, prototype development, testing, and all associated costs from 1940 to 1942. Production costs totaled approximately $440 million for 22 million fuses, roughly $20 per unit as previously mentioned. Total program cost, approximately $460 million, 1944 dollars, equivalent to roughly $8 billion in 2025 dollars. For this investment, America gained a weapon that increased anti-aircraft effectiveness by 500 to 1,700%, defense against the V-1 that saved thousands of British civilian lives, protection for naval vessels against kamikaze attacks, saving thousands of sailors, artillery effectiveness against ground targets that shortened campaigns, a foundation technology that influenced post-war defense systems, manufacturing expertise in miniaturization and precision electronics. Few military research programs have achieved comparable return on investment. The Manhattan Project cost approximately $2 billion in 1944 dollars and produced weapons that ended the war but could only be used twice. Radar development cost approximately $3 billion and produced critical capabilities, but not the order of magnitude improvements the proximity fuse achieved in its specific domain. The VT fuse cost a fraction of these programs and produced measurable, sustained impact on combat operations from 1943 through the war's end. In modern warfare, the descendants of the proximity fuse are ubiquitous. Nearly every air defense system, anti-missile interceptor, and smart munition uses some form of proximity detection, whether radio frequency, infrared, laser, or other technologies. The principle remains unchanged. Detect your target without physical contact and detonate at optimal distance. The engineering has advanced from vacuum tubes to solid-state electronics to microprocessors, but Dr. Tuve's team solved the fundamental problem in 1941. Consider the parallels to other American World War II victories that we've explored. The Sherman tank, not the best individual tank, but produced in numbers that made German technical superiority irrelevant. 49,234 Shermans overwhelmed 6,000 Panthers through systematic production advantage. Sonar technology. Japanese submarines thought silence made them invisible. American active sonar made silence meaningless by bouncing sound waves off submarine hulls. Technology that changed the rules defeated tactics optimized for old rules. Enigma code breaking. German confidence in mathematical security was defeated by British mathematicians who were simply better at mathematics. Bletchley Park read Hitler's orders before German generals received them. Proximity fuse. German aircraft and missiles faced a defensive system that didn't require hitting them, just getting close. American scientists solved the impossible problem of miniaturization and mass production, creating a weapon Germany couldn't match. The pattern is consistent. American systematic advantages, industrial production, scientific research coordination, willingness to tackle impossible problems, repeatedly defeated Axis forces who excelled at tactical execution but couldn't match American capacity for strategic innovation. Germany had excellent fighter pilots, but America produced more pilots with adequate training. Germany had superior tank designs, but America produced adequate tanks in overwhelming numbers. Germany had sophisticated submarines, but America developed sonar that made stealth irrelevant. Germany had V-weapons, but America invented fuses that shot them down. Individual excellence lost to systematic superiority every single time. The proximity fuse represents perhaps the purest example of this dynamic. It wasn't bigger guns or more ships or braver soldiers. It was scientists and engineers solving hard problems, industry manufacturing solutions at scale, and military forces deploying technology that enemies couldn't counter because they didn't understand it existed. In the final analysis, the VT proximity fuse changed warfare by changing mathematics. Before the proximity fuse, shooting down an aircraft required a projectile to physically hit a small, fast-moving target in three-dimensional space, a mathematical problem with very low probability of success. The proximity fuse changed the equation. Success no longer required hitting the target, just getting within 50 to 70 feet. This expanded the success zone from a few cubic feet to a sphere containing thousands of cubic feet. The probability mathematics shifted from nearly impossible to highly likely. This is why the transformation was so dramatic. 4% to 87% success rates didn't represent incremental improvement in aiming. It represented fundamentally different mathematics of interception. German gunners and German engineers never understood this shift because they never knew the weapon existed. They kept trying to improve within the old mathematical framework: better radar, better training, better tactics. While American forces had changed to a completely different framework where the old rules no longer applied. By the time Germany discovered proximity fuses in unexploded shells and began to understand what they faced, it was too late. America had fired millions of them. The technology had already decided key battles. No German countermeasure could be developed fast enough to matter. This is how wars are won. Not through fighting harder within existing rules, but through changing the rules themselves in ways opponents can't match. If you found this story of secret technology and revolutionary science surprising, you need to see our other videos uncovering how American innovation, not just battlefield courage, won World War II. We've documented dozens of similar stories, the weapons, systems, and breakthroughs that Axis powers never understood until it was too late. Hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss these true stories of how science and industry defeated tactical excellence. We release new content every day revealing the real secrets of Allied victory. Drop a comment below telling us what shocked you most about this story. Was it the 4% to 87% success rate transformation? That Germany never figured out what proximity fuses were despite examining them? That a $20 fuse could replace thousands of dollars worth of conventional ammunition? That Eisenhower ranked this as the third most important technology of the war, alongside radar and the atomic bomb? Subscribe to War Rewind, where we show you how American innovation changed the rules of warfare, one revolutionary technology at a time. The proximity fuse represents everything this channel explores: how systematic American advantages, scientific research, industrial production, coordinated innovation, defeated enemies who excelled at individual tactics but couldn't match American capacity for game-changing breakthroughs. Germany launched 94 V-1 flying bombs on August 28, 1944. British anti-aircraft guns destroyed 82 of them. And Germany never knew why until after the war ended. That's the power of technology that changes the mathematics of warfare. That's how America won. See you in the next video.